Pass it on to our first speaker. I don't know, how could I describe him? I could spend a lot of time sort of ticking off his credentials. Dr. Alex Wodak is one of the leading drug law reform experts and advocates in Australia. Helped set up the first needle syringe program in the world, which has kept HIV rates in injecting drug users in Australia under 2%, which is something that hasn't been achieved anywhere else in the world. He helped set up the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre, was the head of the St Vincent's, you might have to correct me on the Alcohol and Drug Service for 30 years, recently retired, and he's the head of the Australian Drug Foundation. He's going to talk to us today about some human rights issues and drug use. Could you please make Dr. Alex Wodak welcome? Once I get his slideshow up. Here we go. Which one do I click? Slide sorter? Is that it?
Two more. Yeah.
That one. Thank you, everyone. See what I mean about the tech stuff? Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Ash, for that introduction. And thank you very much, Ash and Chloe and Marg, for the work you're doing for Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And thank you all for coming along. Now, I'm going to be talking about different reasons for supporting drug law reform, and particularly the reason I'm going to talk about today is the unfairness and the injustice of majorities punishing people with minority drug preferences. Now, I want to start by acknowledging the work that Milton Friedman did a long time ago in his contribution to drug law reform. He wasn't the first person to advocate major drug law reform, but he advocated at a time when he was in a very tiny minority. He was President Reagan's economics advisor. He wrote a famous letter to President Reagan in Newsweek about the need for drug law reform. He was outspoken on the issue. He was way ahead of his time. And those of you who haven't looked at things he said, there are wonderful quotes of Milton Friedman's on the need for drug law reform on the internet. And one thing is very clear, and that is that he really got this issue. And so it's right and proper that this conference continues to show an interest in the need for drug law reform. Sad to say, we haven't, despite all the discussion, and that you've heard a bit from Tim about this as well, in terms of actual advancement, we haven't really advanced all that much from Milton Friedman's day. Now, the three main arguments that people use for talking about drug law reform, and the first argument is that our current drug policy has failed, and it's failed in several respects. It's failed to achieve its objectives. This is a harder argument to pursue than you might think, because the proponents of drug prohibition were always careful to never say exactly what the objectives of drug prohibition were. So it's hard to say that they've failed, but by any test of being reasonable, it's clear that drug prohibition has failed. And it's failed in two clear respects. Firstly, the drug market has continued to expand, and it's become also not just expanded, but it's also become much more dangerous over time. And even more important than that, the outcomes from drug policy have become worse and worse. And these are things like increasing numbers of deaths, disease, crime, corruption, violence, even threats to national security. So it's a failure in terms of markets and outcomes. It's also a failure in terms of the severe unintended negative consequences of this policy. And these are self-evident. And in a third way, it's also clear that it's cost ineffective. It's turned out to be an expensive way of making bad problems even worse. That's really the first set of arguments that's used to argue for change. The second set of arguments is that there are better ways of managing drugs than to enforce drug laws. And essentially what is being said here in different ways is that we should be redefining our approach away from a criminal justice-dominated approach to one which is primarily based on health and social interventions. Secondly, that these would need to be funded properly. At the moment, the bulk of the funding, 66% of Commonwealth, state and territory funding in this country allocated to responding to drugs goes to drug law enforcement. Only 21% goes to treatment, 9% to prevention, 2% to harm reduction. And it's the smaller amounts that actually do most of the heavy lifting. The drug law enforcement does surprisingly little. Thirdly, we should be reducing the emphasis on punishment by reducing the penalties and also reducing the increasing the thresholds at which these criminal laws start operating. And fourthly, and most difficult of all, is that we should start regulating as much of the black market as we can. At the moment, the regulation of the market is left to the criminals, and ultimately the state has to start taking as much of that over as possible. Now, these are the standard arguments for drug law reform, and they are sound arguments, and they are getting increasing traction. But they're based on the assumption that the drug laws are fair and just. And I think we really need to question that. We nearly need to ask ourselves, would we still support drug laws if they were effective and if they were the best way of managing the problem, if we thought in our heart of hearts that these laws were unfair and unjust? And I hope, if we considered that the laws were unfair and unjust, I hope that this would make us reconsider our commitment to drug prohibition. Now, I think there are a lot of parallels between the criminalisation of drug use and the criminalisation of homosexuality. Let's, mistake on the first line, take our minds back to 1895 when, it says 1995 there, when Oscar Wilde was given 2 years hard labour for having sex with another man. 1952, Alan Turing was given a choice of sentencing options when he was found guilty of having sex with another man. And he was given the choice of going to prison or taking estrogens. He took estrogens and couldn't cope with the changes to his body that the estrogens made, and ended up injecting cyanide into an apple and committing suicide. For those of you who don't know who Alan Turing was, he was responsible for decoding the Nazi code, secret code, using the famous Enigma machine, arguably shortening the Second World War by 2 years, saving, so it's believed, 14 million lives in the process. And he was also made a major role in contributing to the development of these guys that most of us now possess. So he changed our lives for the better in huge ways. And here he was, criminalised and punished in the United Kingdom. And that led in 1957, so it's believed, to the establishment of the Wolfenden Commission. And in their report in the United Kingdom, they recognised they recommended that people who have consenting sex with other adults in private, people of their same sex, should not be punished for it. And it took a long time before the UK got around to civil partnerships in 2004 under the Blair Labor government, and then under the Cameron Conservative government in 2014, the British finally achieved marriage equality, which unfortunately we are yet to achieve. Now, a lot of parallels I would put to you between what we have done in many countries to criminalise and to punish people with minority sexual preferences, and the punishment of people who have minority taste in drugs but aren't harming anybody else. If they're harming anybody else, if they're robbing a bank, of course, we don't want people to rob banks. We don't want people to be violent to anyone else. Anyone who does that should be punished. But absent harm to others, why should the majority punish people who have minority taste in drugs? And so I put it to you that that really is the most fundamental objection that I think that we should all have to our current drug laws. Now, this is a line of argument, frankly, that doesn't appeal to many people in the community. It appeals to a lot of lawyers, but apart from lawyers, many people don't really get that our laws really should be fair and just. If you think about it, though, it's a big deal when the state punishes its citizens. And in every country in the world, there's a strong commitment to doing that properly, to make sure that the parliaments or legislatures pass the right laws in the first place, that the judicial system carefully considers each individual case and makes sure that the guilty are punished and the innocent are set free. There's a lot of emphasis in all our legal systems, all of our different kind of communities around the world. And yet here we are punishing people because they're taking the wrong kind of drug, even if they're not hurting anybody else. So some people put this argument out as saying that we have a right to take drugs. Now, that's got even less traction than the line of argument that I've put to you about the unfairness and injustice. So each of us has to make our own decisions about whether we try and argue in ways that we know are more likely to persuade people, or whether we argue things that we feel more passionate about. But I think this is a very important part of the arguments for drug law reform, and I'd urge you to consider that. Now, it's slightly different in the United States, where there is a Bill of Rights. Many other countries have human rights acts. It's easier to argue this third strand of argument in those kind of countries. But Australia has weak protection for human rights, and it's even harder in Australia to get across this argument that a major criticism of our current drug laws should be that they are unfair and unjust. So I know we haven't got a lot of time. I hope that we'll have a lot of questions and answers, but I think we can take a lot of encouragement from the fact that there is growing support for drug law reform in Australia. In a review carried out by Essential Media and Communications last September, 55% of Australians now support taxing and regulating cannabis. That's only about 5% less than in the United States, and that poll hadn't been carried out before using those words, but clearly that view is strengthening, that cannabis should be taxed and regulated. That's getting more support. Most of the increase in support that we've had in recent years has been due to these arguments that our current drug policy has failed. More and more people are saying this now. Yesterday, the New South Wales Police Minister, Troy Grant, who's a former policeman and is a very strong advocate for our current drug laws, conceded that our current drug laws are not working. And 3 years ago, the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott said the war on drugs is the war that we cannot win and is the war that we can lose. So we are getting more and more traction around this issue. But I think we do need to encourage more and more people to the view that even if the laws worked, they are unfair and unjust, and on those grounds alone, we should not be supporting them. There's been considerable advocacy for drug law reform in Australia for 30 years. Despite that, there's not a lot to show on the ground for in terms of change of policy. There has been some change in policy. We have a different situation in this country compared to the United States. Philanthropy is pretty weak in this country, and it's very difficult to raise funds for this issue. Nevertheless, I think in many respects we've won the intellectual debate, but the intellectual debate has to be followed by winning the political debate, and that's much more difficult than winning the intellectual debate. I think we need to be careful which arguments we use, and we should use the arguments that are going to most rapidly bring about change, because the current situation is causing too many deaths, too much disease, causes a lot of crime, and costs a fortune. So thank you very much, and look forward to your questions.